Let me be absolutely direct with you right now, because what just happened in the last 72 hours is one of the most consequential geopolitical decisions of the 21st century, and almost nobody in the Western press is telling you the real story. China did not simply renew a trade deal with Iran. China did not simply announce another infrastructure corridor. China made a strategic choice, a deliberate, calculated, irreversible choice to stand with Tehran at the precise moment that Donald Trump was offering Beijing an off-ramp, an invitation, a handshake across the Pacific. And Beijing looked at that handshake, looked at Trump's tariff rollbacks, looked at the whole package on the table and said, no, we choose Iran. And in doing so, they chose the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that means. Think about it very carefully. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles. And through those 21 miles flows approximately 20% of the entire world's oil supply every single day. Tankers carrying Saudi crude, Emirati crude, Iraqi crude, Kuwaiti crude, Qatari liquefied natural gas, all of it funneled through a choke point so narrow you can see both coastlines from the deck of a passing vessel. For 70 years, the implicit guarantee of safe passage through that strait has been American naval power. The Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, has been the silent enforcer, the invisible hand that kept the global economy breathing. And that guarantee, that American promise, was always predicated on one thing, that Iran would not be allowed to dominate the Persian Gulf. Beijing just changed that equation permanently. Here is what you need to understand about the China-Iran relationship right now. Because the Western media keeps describing it as transactional, as a simple buyer-seller arrangement. China buys discounted sanctioned oil, Iran gets hard currency, everybody is happy, and nothing structural has changed. That framing is dangerously, embarrassingly wrong. What Beijing has been building with Tehran since 2021 is not a trade relationship. It is a strategic architecture. The 25-year cooperation agreement signed between China and Iran, worth, at various estimates, somewhere between $400 billion and $600 billion, is not a commodity deal. It is a blueprint for Iranian integration into China's entire regional security framework. Chinese telecommunications infrastructure is going into Iranian cities. Chinese surveillance technology is going into Iranian government systems. Chinese military advisors, and this is documented, this is not speculation, are present in Iranian defense institutions. And crucially, Chinese naval vessels have been conducting joint exercises with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Let that sit with you for a moment. The Chinese Navy in joint exercises with the IRGC in the waters adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. Now you tell me, who controls that strait? Trump made his play. He made it loudly, publicly, with the characteristic bluster that is simultaneously his greatest negotiating weapon and his most exploitable weakness. He offered Beijing relief on semiconductor export controls. He dangled the possibility of a framework agreement that would have given Chinese technology companies broader access to American markets. His team signaled through back channels and through public statements that a genuine strategic realignment was available if Beijing was willing to distance itself from Tehran, from Moscow, from the broader anti-dollar coalition that has been quietly assembling itself over the last 4 years. The offer was real, it was substantive, it was, from a narrow economic perspective, enormously attractive. Beijing said no. And the reason Beijing said no is the reason that nobody in Washington seems to want to confront directly, because confronting it means admitting something deeply uncomfortable about the last 2 decades of American foreign policy. China does not believe the United States will honor its commitments. This is not paranoia. This is not anti-American propaganda. This is a conclusion that Beijing has reached through the cold, systematic analysis of American behavior since 2001. They watched Washington promise stability in Iraq and deliver chaos. They watched the United States guarantee the security of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi after he surrendered his nuclear program, and then watched NATO bomb him out of power 3 years later. They watched the Obama administration's pivot to Asia evaporate under the weight of Middle Eastern entanglements. They watched Trump himself, in his first term, tear up the Iran nuclear deal that his own predecessor had negotiated, reimposing sanctions on a country that had complied with every provision of the agreement. And then they watched a new American administration come in, promise to restore that deal, and fail. And then they watched Trump return. If you are sitting in Zhongnanhai, if you are part of the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo Standing Committee, if you have spent your career watching the United States oscillate between engagement and confrontation, between multilateralism and unilateralism, between strategic patience and impulsive escalation, what conclusion do you draw? You draw the conclusion that the American strategic commitment has a shelf life of approximately 4 years, that it evaporates with every presidential transition, and that any country that bets its survival on American promises is making a catastrophic error. Tehran drew that conclusion in 2018. Beijing internalized it completely. So when Trump came back to the table and said, essentially, choose us over Iran, Beijing's response was not just an economic calculation. It was an existential one, because the moment Beijing publicly distanced itself from Tehran, the moment China allowed American pressure to fracture the Russia-Iran-China alignment that has been building since the Ukraine war began, Beijing would have demonstrated that it can be coerced, that American tariffs and export controls and financial sanctions can force strategic realignment. And if Beijing demonstrates that once, it invites that pressure permanently. Every subsequent American administration would reach for the same tool, knowing it works. Beijing will not demonstrate that, ever. And so here we are, the Strait of Hormuz. Let us talk about what control of that strait actually means in practical terms, because this is where the analysis moves from the abstract to the terrifyingly concrete. Iran has spent the last 15 years developing what military analysts call an anti-access area denial capability in the Persian Gulf. They have fast attack boats. They have anti-ship ballistic missiles, the kind that can be fired from mobile launchers deep inside Iranian territory and strike a moving vessel with precision. They have drone swarms tested extensively, refined through the Yemen proxy war, now capable of saturating American carrier group defenses. They have sea mines stockpiled in sufficient quantities to make Gulf transit functionally impossible within hours of a decision to deploy them. The United States knows all of this. The Fifth Fleet knows all of this, and the uncomfortable reality is that the cost of keeping the Strait of Hormuz open by force, if Iran decides to close it, has become extraordinarily high. Now add Chinese intelligence sharing, now add Chinese satellite coverage, now add the possibility, and I want to be precise here, I am not saying this is certain, I am saying this is the logical endpoint of the trajectory. The possibility that Chinese dual-use technology, components, and systems find their way into Iranian military capability in ways that further degrade the American military advantage in those waters. The Strait of Hormuz becomes contested in a way it has never been contested before. Japan imports 87% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea imports approximately the same percentage. India's energy security runs directly through those waters. Europe, despite its pivot toward alternative supplies, remains exposed to Gulf disruption through global price mechanisms. Every country on Earth that runs on petroleum, which is to say every country on Earth, is now dependent on a waterway whose security architecture has been fundamentally altered by a decision made in Beijing. And what is the American response? Sanctions. More sanctions. Sanctions on Iranian oil purchasers, which means, theoretically, sanctions on Chinese companies buying Iranian crude, which China will ignore, as it has ignored every prior round of sanctions, because China has spent the last decade building a parallel financial infrastructure, a parallel shipping insurance system, a parallel payment mechanism, specifically to be sanction-proof. The whole point of the yuan-denominated oil trade, of the CIPS system, of the Chinese-controlled shipping companies that operate under flags of convenience, all of it was constructed as a hedge against exactly this moment. Washington is holding a weapon that Beijing deliberately spent a decade rendering harmless. There is a deeper strategic logic here that Americans are going to struggle to accept. China is not trying to defeat the United States militarily. China does not need to. What China is doing, patiently, systematically, with the kind of long-horizon strategic vision that a one-party state with an uninterrupted institutional memory can sustain, is repositioning itself as the indispensable power in every region that the United States has treated as peripheral. The Persian Gulf was treated as peripheral. That is not a characterization I am inventing. The last 3 American administrations have explicitly, publicly stated that America's strategic focus is shifting away from the Middle East toward the Indo-Pacific. The pivot to Asia, the offshore balancing doctrine, the endless declarations that the United States is done fighting other people's wars in the desert. Beijing heard those declarations, Tehran heard them, and they acted accordingly. The Strait of Hormuz is not theirs because they seized it. They did not need to seize it. They simply had to wait for the United States to announce, repeatedly and credibly, that it was leaving. And then they moved into the space that announcement created. This is what strategic patience looks like. This is what playing a long game looks like. And the terrifying thing, the thing that should be keeping policymakers in Washington and Tokyo and Brussels up at night, is that this is only the first domino. Because if the Strait of Hormuz is the Persian Gulf domino, then the Taiwan Strait is the next one on the table. And the South China Sea, and the Malacca Strait, and every other choke point through which the arteries of the global economy run, China just demonstrated something to every country watching. It demonstrated that alignment with Beijing provides strategic cover, economic resources, and diplomatic protection that no American promise, however generous, however loudly proclaimed, can match. Because American promises expire. Chinese infrastructure does not expire. Chinese investment does not come with an election cycle attached to it. The question is no longer whether China will challenge American hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. That question has been answered. The question is whether the United States has the institutional capacity, the strategic coherence, and the political will to respond to a challenge that has been building for 20 years while Washington was looking somewhere else. And right now, watching what is unfolding in the Persian Gulf, watching Beijing's quiet consolidation of everything that America said it was leaving behind, the honest answer to that question is that nobody in Washington knows.